The Montana sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Samuel Hartwell's boots scraped against the rocky ground, his hands bound tight behind his back with coarse rope that bit into his weathered skin. 3 men flanked him: Jake Morrison, his foreman of 5 years, Pete Caldwell, the wrangler he'd trusted with his prize horses, and Dutch Coroner, the newest hand he'd foolishly taken in last spring when the man claimed to be down on his luck. "You boys don't have to do this," Hartwell rasped, his voice hoarse from the gag they'd only just removed. Blood trickled from a split lip where Dutch had struck him with the butt of his Colt. "Whatever you think you know about my business, we can work something out." Jake Morrison spat into the dust, his weather-beaten face twisted with years of resentment. "Work something out? Like you worked it out for my brother when he asked for a raise to feed his family. Told him to find work elsewhere, didn't you, Hartwell?" The creek gurgled nearby, its waters running clear and cold despite the oppressive heat. Willow branches swayed in the slight breeze, their leaves whispering secrets that would soon include murder. Hartwell's legs trembled, not from fear but from the beating they'd given him back at the ranch house after finding his hidden safe behind the loose stone in the fireplace. 40,000 in gold coins, Pete Caldwell said, hefting the heavy leather satchel. "Been hiding this from us while paying us scraps, making us work like dogs while you lived like a king." Dutch Kerner checked his pocket watch, a nervous habit that had irritated Hartwell since the day he'd hired him. "We need to finish this and get moving. That supply wagon from town ain't due for 3 days, but someone might come looking." Hartwell's mind raced. His nearest neighbor was old Ezra Blackwood, 15 miles east, and they rarely spoke. The townspeople of Dustridge knew him as a solitary man who kept to himself. Dutch was right. No one would come looking for days, maybe weeks. "Listen to me carefully," Hartwell said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That gold represents 20 years of hard work. Cattle drives, deals with the railroad, investments in Denver. I earned every coin. On the backs of men like us," Jake snarled. "Men you paid pennies while you counted your fortune. I paid fair wages." The blow came from Pete's fist, connecting with Hartwell's stomach and doubling him over. He gasped, tasting bile and blood. "Fair wages." Pete's voice cracked with emotion. "My Sarah died last winter because I couldn't afford to bring the doctor from town. Fair wages don't buy medicine for a sick wife, Hartwell." The rancher straightened slowly, seeing the pain in Pete's eyes, pain that had hardened into something cold and deadly. These weren't just hired hands anymore. They were men whose grievances had festered like infected wounds. "Sarah's death wasn't my fault, Pete. I'm sorry for your loss, but nothing." Jake grabbed Hartwell's shirt, his fingers twisting in the fabric. "You've got blood on your hands, same as we will in a minute. Difference is, we ain't pretending to be righteous." Dutch had wandered closer to the creek, his boots crunching on the pebbled bank. "Water's deep here, currents strong from the snowmelt up in the mountains. Body might wash all the way to the Missouri before anyone finds it." "If anyone finds it," Jake corrected. Hartwell looked at each man in turn. Jake's face was set in grim determination, but his hands shook slightly. Pete clutched his wife's locket, the same locket Hartwell had seen him kiss every morning before heading out to the pastures. Dutch appeared the calmest, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the shade from the willows. "You want the gold, take it," Hartwell said quietly. "But killing me won't bring back Pete's wife or help Jake's brother. It'll just make you murderers." "We're already murderers," Dutch said, drawing his pistol. "Question is whether we want to be poor murderers or rich ones." A red-tailed hawk cried overhead, circling on thermals rising from the sun-baked earth. In the distance, cattle lowed peacefully, unaware their owner was about to die. The creek continued its eternal song, indifferent to human suffering. Jake pulled out a length of rope. "We'll make it look like an accident. Say he fell from his horse, hit his head on the rocks." "With his hands bound?" Pete asked. "We'll untie him after," Dutch replied. "Bruises will make sense if his horse threw him." Hartwell's heart hammered against his ribs. 20 years ago, he'd faced down rustlers and hostile tribes to build his ranch. He'd survived blizzards, drought, and economic panic, but he'd never faced betrayal from men he'd trusted with his life. "My will," he said suddenly. "It leaves everything to my nephew in Chicago. You kill me, lawyers will come sniffing around within a month." Jake hesitated, the rope slack in his hands. "He's lying," Dutch said. "Rich man like that, probably got no family. Why else would he live alone out here like a hermit?" The lie bought Hartwell precious seconds, but he could see doubt flickering in Jake's eyes. The foreman had always been the cautious one, thinking through consequences. "Even so," Jake said slowly, $40,000 buys a lot of distance. We could be in California before anyone misses him. Pete nodded eagerly. New names, new lives. Hell, I could buy a little farm, maybe find me a good woman to settle down with. The dream of escape shone in their faces, and Hartwell realized his fate was sealed. These weren't cold-blooded killers. They were desperate men who'd convinced themselves murder was their only path to freedom. Dutch raised his pistol, thumb on the hammer. Nothing personal, Hartwell, just business. The shot echoed across the prairie like thunder. 10-year-old Tommy Sullivan crouched behind a boulder, 50 yards upstream from where the gunshot had echoed, his small body trembling not from fear, but from hunger. He'd been tracking the creek for 2 days, living off wild berries and creek water, searching for the rumored swimming hole where travelers sometimes dropped coins or lost belongings in the sand. The boy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patched trousers that had belonged to at least 3 other boys before him, and a cotton shirt with sleeves rolled up to hide the holes at the elbows. His bare feet were tough as leather from months of wandering, but his face still held the softness of childhood beneath the dirt and determination. Tommy had learned to move silent as a ghost during his time on the streets of Dustridge. When you were small and alone, making noise meant trouble, whether from hostile adults, wild animals, or older boys who'd take what little you had. So when he heard voices by the creek, he'd dropped low and listened. The conversation had chilled him. 3 men planning to kill another for gold. Tommy had seen plenty of violence in his short life, drunken brawls outside saloons, beatings in the alleyways where he sometimes slept. But cold-blooded murder was different. It carried a weight that settled in your bones. When the gunshot cracked across the water, Tommy squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his face against the sun-warmed rock. A splash followed, then voices again. "Help me get these ropes off him," one man said. "Jake, you and Pete scatter some rocks around, make it look like he hit his head falling. Look at all this blood," another voice replied, sounding queasy. "You sure that shot killed him?" "Shot him through the chest. He's done for." Tommy waited, counting his heartbeats like his pa had taught him before the cholera took both his parents 3 summers ago. When hunting, Pa had said, patience meant the difference between eating and starving. Right now, patience meant the difference between living and joining the dead man in the creek. Minutes stretched like hours before he heard horses galloping away, their hoofbeats fading into the vast silence of the prairie. Tommy remained still until even the dust had settled, then crept forward through the willows. The man lay face down in the shallows, his fine wool shirt dark with blood and creek water. Silver hair fanned around his head like a halo, and his hands, now unbound, floated pale beneath the surface. Tommy had seen enough death to recognize it, but something made him wade into the cold water anyway. Maybe it was the way the man's fingers twitched slightly in the current. Maybe it was the faint rise and fall of his back. Or maybe it was just the desperate hope of a boy who'd been alone too long. But Tommy reached down and grabbed the man's shoulders, straining with all his strength to turn him over. The face that emerged was weathered and strong, with deep lines around closed eyes. Blood frothed at the corner of his mouth, but his chest still moved with shallow breaths. The bullet had taken him high in the left shoulder, not through the heart as the shooters had intended. "Mister," Tommy whispered, glancing nervously around the empty landscape. "Mister, can you hear me?" Samuel Hartwell's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. His lips moved soundlessly before a weak voice emerged. "Boy, how long?" "Just happened, mister. Them men, they shot you and rode off." Tommy struggled to keep the heavy man's head above water. "Said they was gonna make it look like an accident." Hartwell's gaze sharpened slightly, taking in the child's ragged appearance and earnest face. You saw? I heard 'em talking about your gold, about killing you." Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I was hiding up the creek, looking for dropped coins or such." A bitter laugh escaped Hartwell's lips, followed by a coughing fit that brought up more blood. "Gold! Curse that gold! What's your name, boy?" "Tommy Sullivan, sir." "My folks is dead." "Tommy Sullivan." Hartwell tried to sit up and nearly passed out from the effort. "Listen to me, Tommy. Need to get out of this water. Get to shelter." The boy looked around desperately. The nearest trees were cottonwoods along the creek bank, offering little protection. But about a quarter-mile upstream, he remembered seeing what looked like an old cabin tucked back in a grove of aspens. "There's a cabin up that way," Tommy said. "Think you can make it if I help?" Hartwell studied the boy's face, dirt-streaked but honest, with green eyes that held more wisdom than any 10-year-old should possess. In his 43 years, Hartwell had learned to read men quickly. This child had been tested by life and found strong. "Why?" Hartwell asked quietly. Why help a stranger, especially one with a price on his head? Tommy considered the question seriously. My pa used to say that what you do when nobody's watching is who you really are. Ain't nobody watching but God out here, and he already knows if I'm good or bad. The simple honesty of it nearly broke Hartwell's heart. When had he last encountered such pure moral reasoning? His own world had become one of contracts, negotiations, and calculated risks. This boy operated on principles that Hartwell had forgotten he once believed in. "Help me up then," Hartwell said. The next 20 minutes became a nightmare of pain and determination. Tommy, despite weighing less than 80 pounds, somehow managed to get the wounded rancher to his feet. Hartwell leaned heavily on the boy's thin shoulders as they stumbled through tall grass and scattered rocks toward the distant cabin. Every step sent fire through Hartwell's chest. The bullet had shattered his collarbone and torn through muscle, but miraculously missed his lung and major blood vessels. He'd survive if they could stop the bleeding and avoid infection. "Tell me about yourself, Tommy," Hartwell gasped as they paused to rest against a lightning-struck pine. "How long you been on your own?" "Since spring," the boy replied, scanning the horizon for any sign of the killer's return. "Been staying mostly in Dustridge, but folks there don't much like orphans hanging around. Sleep in the livery stable sometimes or under the church steps." "Family? Anyone looking for you?" Tommy shook his head. "Ma's sister lives in St. Louis, but she's got 6 children of her own. Couldn't take me in." They reached the cabin just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The structure was old but solid, built by some long-gone homesteader who'd probably given up when the harsh winters and isolation became too much. The door hung open on leather hinges, and pack rats had nested in one corner, but the roof looked sound. Tommy helped Hartwell collapse onto a makeshift bed of old hay and horse blankets someone had left behind. The rancher's face was grey with pain and blood loss, but his eyes remained alert. "Water," Hartwell whispered. "Need to clean this wound." Tommy nodded and ran back to the creek with a dented pot he'd found on the cabin's stone hearth. When he returned, Hartwell had managed to tear his shirt open, revealing the ugly hole where the bullet had entered. "You ever tend a wound before?" Hartwell asked. "Some. Helped Doc Patterson in Dustridge a few times when he needed extra hands. He let me sleep in his office during the real cold nights." Tommy's small hands were surprisingly steady as he began washing blood from around the wound. "Bullet's still in there." "I know." Hartwell bit back a scream as the boy probed gently. "Can't dig it out without proper tools. Just clean it best you can and bind it tight." As Tommy worked, Hartwell studied the child's concentrated face. Here was a boy who'd been abandoned by the world, yet chose compassion over bitterness, who'd had every reason to rob a wounded man and flee, but instead risked his own safety to offer help. "Tommy," Hartwell said quietly, "those men who shot me, they'll come back when they realize I'm not dead." The boy's hands paused in their work. "How do you know?" "Because $40,000 makes men do terrible things. And because Jake Morrison isn't stupid enough to leave loose ends." Tommy resumed bandaging, using strips torn from his own shirt. "Then we got to be ready for them." In that simple statement, Hartwell heard something that made his chest tighten with emotion that had nothing to do with his wound. Not "you have to be ready or I should leave before they come," but we. This orphan boy, who owed him nothing, had just declared himself a partner in whatever came next. The first night in the cabin nearly killed Samuel Hartwell. Fever set in as darkness fell, and Tommy found himself battling not just infection, but delirium. The wounded rancher thrashed on his makeshift bed, calling out names from his past: his dead wife, Margaret, his brother who died in the war between the states, business partners from Denver and Cheyenne. Tommy had built a small fire in the stone hearth, keeping it low so the smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. He'd learned that trick from old Pete Hawkins, a trapper who'd sometimes shared his campfire with a hungry boy in exchange for help gathering firewood. "Easy, mister," Tommy whispered, pressing a damp cloth to Hartwell's burning forehead. "You got to stay quiet. Them killers might still be around." But Hartwell was lost in fever dreams, his voice rising as he relived the betrayal. "Jake, no, Pete, think about Sarah. Dutch, you don't understand." Tommy clamped his small hand over the man's mouth, his heart hammering as he listened for any sounds outside. The prairie night was full of noises: coyotes calling in the distance, wind rustling through the aspens, the soft hoot of a great horned owl. Any of those sounds could mask approaching horses. Around midnight, Hartwell's fever broke. His eyes opened, clear and focused for the first time since Tommy had pulled him from the creek. "Boy," he said quietly, "how long was I out?" "Most of the night. You was talking something fierce, had to keep you quiet." Tommy's face showed the strain of hours spent in vigilant watch. "Fever's down now, though." Hartwell tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his entire left arm felt dead and useless. But his mind was sharp again, and he could think clearly about their situation. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. Those men will figure out I'm alive when they don't find my body downstream. When that happens, they'll come looking." "I've been thinking on that," Tommy said, surprising him. "Creek's got a strong current from the snowmelt. If you really was dead, your body could have washed miles downstream by now. They might spend days looking in the wrong places." Hartwell studied the boy with new respect. "That's good thinking. But it only buys us time." "Time for what?" "Time for you to get to town and fetch help." Tommy shook his head firmly. "Ain't leaving you alone. You'd die for sure." "I might die anyway. But you're just a boy. You shouldn't be mixed up in this." "Already mixed up in it," Tommy replied with a stubborn set to his jaw that reminded Hartwell of himself at that age. "Besides, who in town would believe a street orphan, especially telling stories about rich ranchers and stolen gold?" The boy had a point. Sheriff Tom Brennan was honest enough, but he'd want proof before organizing a posse. And by the time Tommy convinced anyone to come out to investigate, Jake Morrison and his partners would have found their trail. "Then we need to be smart about this," Hartwell said. "Tell me what you know about tracking, about hiding." Over the next hour, as dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, an unlikely partnership began to take shape. Tommy shared what he'd learned during months of surviving on his own: which plants were safe to eat, how to move without leaving tracks, where to find water, how to read weather signs. In return, Hartwell began teaching the boy about men like his former employees. "Jake Morrison's the dangerous one," he explained. "Pete's got a good heart twisted up by grief, and Dutch is just greedy. But Jake's got nothing left to lose. His brother died broke and bitter, and Jake blames me for it. He won't give up." "What about the law?" Tommy asked. "Once they figure out you ain't dead, won't Sheriff Brennan come looking?" "Eventually. But Jake knows my habits. Knows I sometimes disappear for weeks when I'm dealing with cattle buyers or checking on remote pastures. Could be a month before anyone thinks to investigate." Tommy stirred the coals in the fireplace, adding a few small sticks to keep the warmth going. "So we got to stay hid and alive for maybe a month? That's about the size of it." The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that shouldn't have belonged to someone so young. "Mr. Hartwell, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Them men, they said you was rich but paid poor wages. They said Pete's wife died because he couldn't afford a doctor." Tommy's green eyes met Hartwell's steadily. "Was that true?" The question hit Hartwell harder than the bullet had. He could have lied, could have painted himself as a victim of ungrateful employees, but something about this boy demanded honesty. "It was true," he said quietly. "I paid what the market would bear, nothing more. Figured if they didn't like it, they could find work elsewhere. But Pete's wife, I heard she was sick. Never thought to ask if Pete needed help with doctor bills." Hartwell's voice grew thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Never occurred to me that a man might be too proud to ask for help, even when his wife was dying." Tommy nodded slowly. "Pride's a powerful thing. Seen lots of folks choose starving over begging. Is that what you think? That I let Pete's wife die out of selfishness?" The boy considered the question seriously. "I think you made choices that seemed right to you at the time. Don't make what they done right, though. Ain't no excuse for murder." The simple wisdom of it astounded Hartwell. This child, who had more reason than most to resent wealthy men, could see the complexity of the situation without losing sight of basic right and wrong. As the sun climbed higher, Tommy ventured out to scout their surroundings and gather edible plants. He moved through the tall grass like a young deer, testing each step for solid ground, pausing frequently to listen and look around. When he returned an hour later, his face was grim. "Found horse tracks," he reported. 3 sets, maybe 2 miles downstream. They're searching the creek banks." Hartwell's blood chilled. "How old were the tracks?" "Few hours, maybe. Ground still soft from dew where they passed." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Tommy helped Hartwell clean and load his pistol, a Colt .45 that had been in his holster when Jake and the others attacked him. The boy's small hands were surprisingly steady as he counted out bullets. "I can shoot," Tommy said quietly when he noticed Hartwell watching him. "Doc Patterson taught me on rats in his cellar. Said every boy should know how to defend himself. Have you ever shot at a man?" "No, sir, but I reckon I could if it came to it." That evening, As shadows lengthened across the prairie, Tommy spotted dust on the horizon. 3 riders approaching slowly, methodically checking every grove of trees and bend in the creek. "They're coming," he whispered. Hartwell struggled to sit up, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. "Tommy, listen to me. When this starts, I want you to run. Head for town and don't look back. Already told you I ain't leaving. Boy, this isn't a game. Those men will kill you just for being a witness." Tommy's jaw set in that stubborn line again. "Maybe, but running away won't guarantee I live neither. And if I run, you'll die for sure. I'm not your responsibility." "Maybe not," Tommy said, checking the loads in an old shotgun he'd found in the cabin's corner. "But you're the first person in a long time who's talked to me like I matter, like what I think counts for something. Figure that's worth fighting for." Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer. Through a crack in the cabin's wall, they could see Jake Morrison in the lead, his face set in grim determination. Pete Caldwell rode beside him, nervous energy making him fidget with his reins. Dutch Kerner brought up the rear, that pocket watch glinting in his hand as he checked the time. "Samuel Hartwell!" Jake's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you're in there. Found your blood trail leading up from the creek." Hartwell and Tommy exchanged glances. So much for hoping the killers would search elsewhere. "Come out peaceful-like and we'll make it quick," Jake continued. "But if we have to come in after you, things might get unpleasant." Hartwell gripped his pistol with his good hand and looked at the boy who'd chosen to stand beside him. Tomorrow, if they survived, he'd have to think about what that meant, what obligations he might owe to this orphan who'd risked everything for a stranger. But tonight, they had a fight to win. The cabin fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the aspen leaves. Tommy crouched beneath the single window, the old shotgun heavy in his small hands. Hartwell positioned himself behind an overturned table, his Colt .45 steady despite the fire in his wounded shoulder. "Hartwell!" Jake Morrison's voice carried across the clearing again. "I know you can hear me. Found your horse wandering loose this morning. Figured you might have crawled off somewhere to die slow." Through a gap in the cabin's weathered logs, Tommy could see the 3 men spreading out. Jake remained mounted in front of the cabin, while Pete circled toward the back and Dutch moved to flank the left side. They knew what they were doing. "Smart," Hartwell whispered. "They're not going to give us any easy shots." "What do we do?" Tommy's voice was steady, but Hartwell could see the boy's knuckles white where he gripped the shotgun. "We wait. Make them come to us." Hartwell's mind raced through possibilities. The cabin had 1 door and 2 small windows. Not many ways in, but not many ways out either. "Tommy, that scattergun will only be good for 1 shot at close range. Make it count." The boy nodded, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. "Last chance, Hartwell," Jake called out. "Come out with your hands up. Tell us where you really hid that gold, and this ends quick." "Even if I wanted to," Hartwell called back. "You boys already tried to kill me once. Why should I trust you now?" "Because you ain't got a choice." Dutch's voice came from the left side of the cabin. "We got you surrounded and you're bleeding like a stuck pig." Pete's voice joined from behind the cabin, high and nervous. "Samuel, please, this don't have to get ugly. Just tell us about the gold and we'll ride away. You got my word." "Your word?" Hartwell's laugh was bitter. "Like the word you gave when you swore loyalty as my employee? Like the promise you made to work honest for honest pay?" "Honest pay?" Pete's voice cracked with emotion. "Sarah died because your honest pay couldn't buy medicine. She died calling my name, asking why I couldn't help her." The anguish in Pete's voice almost made Hartwell waver. He could picture the man's wife, a kind woman who'd sometimes sent fresh bread to the ranch house, who tended the men's wounds and mended their clothes without being asked. "Pete," Hartwell said quietly, "I'm sorry about Sarah. Sorrier than you know. But killing me won't bring her back." "Maybe not," Pete replied, "but it'll stop you from letting other wives die while you count your money." Tommy glanced at Hartwell, seeing the pain in the older man's face. The boy understood now that this wasn't just about gold. It was about years of resentment, grief, and the terrible arithmetic of poverty that forced men to choose between pride and survival. A shadow moved past the window. Dutch, trying to get a look inside. Tommy shifted the shotgun slightly, tracking the movement. "Boy," Jake called out suddenly, his voice carrying a new menace. "We know you're in there too. Saw your tracks in the mud by the creek. You got no stake in this fight. Walk away now and we'll let you live." Tommy's jaw tightened. "Ain't going nowhere, mister." "Stupid kid," Dutch muttered, loud enough for them to hear. "Jake, let's just burn them out. Set fire to the roof and wait for them to run." "No!" Pete's voice was sharp with alarm. "We agreed. No unnecessary killing. The boy's just a witness. We can scare him into keeping quiet." Witness to murder, Pete, Jake replied coldly. Can't leave witnesses. Through the gap in the logs, Tommy saw Pete's face go pale. The man had been willing to kill his former boss in a moment of rage and desperation, but the thought of murdering a child was breaking something inside him. Hartwell saw it too, the crack in their unity that might be exploited. "Pete!" he called out. "You really want that boy's blood on your hands? Think that's what Sarah would have wanted? Don't you dare speak her name." Pete's voice was raw with pain. "Don't you dare pretend you knew her. I knew her enough to know she was a good woman who tried to see the best in people. You think she'd want you to become a child killer in her memory?" A long silence followed. Tommy could see Pete through a crack in the back wall, sitting his horse with his head bowed, wrestling with his conscience. "Pete's wavering," Hartwell whispered, "if we can turn him." But Jake Morrison had read the same signs. His voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Pete, you listen to me. We've come too far to turn back now. That gold represents a new life for all of us. You can buy a farm, find a new wife, have the family Sarah always wanted, but only if we see this through." "I don't know, Jake." Pete's voice was uncertain. "You want to go back to Dustridge empty-handed? Want to spend the rest of your life working for men like Hartwell, watching them get rich while your dreams die?" Dutch's voice joined in, practical and cold. "Pete, they can identify us now. If we don't finish this, we'll hang. All of us." Tommy saw Pete's shoulders straighten as harsh reality sank in. The man might have moral qualms about killing a child, but he wasn't ready to die for those qualms. "Sorry, boy," Pete called out, his voice hollow. "Jake's right, we can't leave witnesses." "Then come and get us," Tommy replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. The attack came from two directions at once. Jake spurred his horse forward and dove from the saddle, rolling behind a pile of old fence posts near the cabin's front door. Simultaneously, Dutch appeared at the left window, his pistol already firing. The first bullet splintered wood near Tommy's head. The boy dropped flat, raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger when Dutch's face appeared again at the window. The blast was deafening in the small space, and Dutch screamed as buckshot tore across his cheek and shoulder. Hartwell fired twice at Jake's position, forcing the man to keep his head down, but his wounded shoulder made accurate shooting difficult, and he could feel blood seeping through Tommy's bandages. "Dutch!" Jake called out. "Do you hit bad?" "Face is torn up, but I can still shoot." Dutch's voice was thick with pain and rage. "Kids got lucky once. Won't happen again." Pete remained at the back of the cabin, but Tommy could hear him dismounting. 3 grown men with military experience against a wounded rancher and a 10-year-old boy. The odds were grim. "Tommy," Hartwell said quietly, "take my pistol. You're a better shot than me right now." The boy shook his head. "Shotgun's empty, but I still got these." He pulled a handful of shells from his pocket, ammunition he'd found scattered around the cabin. With steady hands, he began reloading. Outside, the 3 men were coordinating their final assault. Jake's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Pete, you go through the back window when I give the word. Dutch, you keep them busy from the side. I'll take the door." "On 3, Dutch replied, his voice slurred from his injuries. "1." Tommy finished loading the shotgun and moved to cover the back window. Hartwell struggled to the door, knowing his left arm was useless but determined to make every shot count with his right. 2. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his parents and wondering if he'd see them soon. But when he opened them again, his resolve was iron hard. He'd made his choice when he pulled Samuel Hartwell from the creek. No regrets now. 3. The cabin exploded into violence. Jake kicked in the front door just as Pete smashed through the back window. Dutch appeared at the side window, his face a mask of blood and fury. But in that moment of coordinated chaos, something unexpected happened. Pete, halfway through the rear window, looked into Tommy's eyes and hesitated. For just an instant he saw not a witness to be eliminated, but a child who reminded him of his own boyhood, of the son he'd never had with Sarah. That instant of hesitation saved Tommy's life and doomed Pete Caldwell. The boy's shotgun roared, catching Pete full in the chest and hurling him back through the window. Jake's gun blazed from the doorway, his bullet creasing Tommy's scalp and spinning the boy around. But Hartwell's .45 answered, and Jake Morrison stumbled backward with a cry of pain, his gun flying from suddenly nerveless fingers. Dutch, seeing his partners down, fired wildly through the side window. His bullets went wide, but one ricocheted off the stone hearth and caught Hartwell in the leg, dropping the rancher to his knees. The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of labored breathing and the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke. Tommy, blood streaming down his face from the scalp wound, struggled to reload the shotgun with trembling hands. Hartwell, now wounded in 2 places, tried to steady his pistol for a finishing shot, but Jake Morrison wasn't finished. Despite the bullet in his shoulder, he rolled behind the doorframe and called out one final time, "Dutch! The fire! Burn them out!" Through the smoke and pain, Tommy saw Dutch strike a match. The match flared in Dutch Kerner's bloody hand as he reached toward the dry wood of the cabin's exterior wall. But before he could set it to the timber, a rifle shot cracked across the prairie, and Dutch pitched forward with a grunt of surprise. "Drop your weapons, this is Sheriff Brennan." Tommy and Hartwell stared at each other in amazement as the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, they could see riders spreading out, 6 men in total, led by a tall figure wearing a star on his vest. Jake Morrison still clutched his wounded shoulder behind the doorframe, called out desperately, "Sheriff, thank God you're here. Hartwell's gone crazy, killed Pete and Dutch." "That's interesting, Jake." Sheriff Tom Brennan's voice was dry as desert wind. "Seeing as how Doc Patterson sent a boy to fetch me this morning, said he'd treated a child with a scalp wound who told quite a different story about what happened at the Hartwell ranch." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Doc Patterson?" Through the broken rear window, they heard another familiar voice. "Tommy Sullivan, you in there, boy?" "Doc?" Tommy called out weakly. "How'd you know where to find us?" Dr. Elias Patterson appeared at the window, his medical bag in hand, and concern etched on his weathered face. "Tracked the blood trail from the creek, same as these killers did. But I had Sheriff Brennan and his men with me." The old doctor climbed through the window with surprising agility for a man past 60. His eyes quickly assessed the scene. Pete Caldwell's body, the wounded Tommy and Hartwell, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that filled the air. "Jake Morrison," Sheriff Brennan called out, "step away from that doorway with your hands visible. You're under arrest for attempted murder and theft." "You don't understand." Jake's voice was desperate now. "Hartwell's been cheating us for years. He deserved—" "What a man deserves and what the law allows are 2 different things," Brennan interrupted. "Now drop that gun before I have my men drop you." The fight went out of Jake Morrison like air from a punctured balloon. His pistol clattered to the ground, and he stumbled into the open, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Dr. Patterson immediately went to work on Tommy's scalp wound, while Sheriff Brennan surveyed the carnage. Dutch Kerner was still alive but unconscious, the sheriff's rifle shot having taken him in the shoulder. Pete Caldwell would never see another sunrise. "Doc," Tommy whispered as the physician cleaned his wound. "How'd you know to come looking?" Patterson's eyes twinkled despite the grim circumstances. "You think an old country doctor doesn't notice when a street boy disappears for 3 days, especially one who's been helping me tend patients." He tied off the bandage with practiced hands. "When you didn't show up yesterday morning for your usual breakfast scraps, I got worried. But how'd you know where we were?" "Asked around town. Heard that Jake Morrison and his partners had been seen riding toward Willow Creek. Put 2 and 2 together." Patterson moved to examine Hartwell's wounds. "This man needs proper surgery for that shoulder, but he'll live." Sheriff Brennan knelt beside Jake Morrison, applying pressure to the man's wound while his deputies secured the scene. "Jake, you want to tell me what really happened here?" Morrison's face was grey with pain and defeat. "Found Hartwell's gold, 40,000 in coins hidden in his fireplace. We thought if he was dead, no one would know we took it. So you shot him and left him for dead by the creek?" "Yes." The admission came out as barely a whisper. "And when you realized he'd survived, you came back to finish the job?" Jake nodded, unable to meet the sheriff's eyes. Brennan stood, shaking his head. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for attempted murder, theft, and conspiracy. Dutch Kerner too when he wakes up." As his deputies loaded the prisoners into a wagon, Brennan turned to Tommy and Hartwell. "Now, I want to hear the whole story from the beginning." Over the next hour, as Dr. Patterson worked to stabilize Hartwell's wounds, Tommy told everything, from finding the rancher in the creek to the desperate fight in the cabin. He spoke clearly and honestly, holding nothing back. When the boy finished, Sheriff Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "Son, what you did took more courage than most grown men could muster. You saved this man's life, and you helped us catch 3 killers." "I just did what seemed right," Tommy said simply. Hartwell, despite his pain and blood loss, had been listening to every word. When Tommy finished his account, the rancher reached out with his good hand and grasped the boy's arm. "Tommy Sullivan," he said quietly, "you asked me yesterday if I thought I'd been fair to my employees. The answer is no. I wasn't fair and I wasn't kind. But you showed me what real fairness looks like, what real loyalty means. The boy looked confused. "Sir, I'm saying I owe you more than my life. I owe you a lesson in what it means to be a decent human being." Dr. Patterson finished bandaging Hartwell's leg wound and sat back on his heels. "Samuel, you need to get to town for proper treatment, and this boy needs a good meal and a real bed." "About that," Hartwell said, his voice growing stronger despite his injuries. "Sheriff Brennan, I want to make some things official." "What kind of things?" Hartwell looked directly at Tommy. "This boy has no family, no home, no prospects, but he's got more character in his little finger than I had in my whole body before today." Tommy's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "Tommy Sullivan," Hartwell continued, "I'd like you to come live at my ranch, not as a hired hand or charity case, but as, well, as the son I never had." The boy's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Dr. Patterson smiled, and even Sheriff Brennan looked pleased. "I don't know nothing about ranching," Tommy whispered. "I'll teach you, and more than that, I'll send you to school in Denver. Make sure you get a proper education. The ranch will be yours someday, if you want it." "But your gold—" "The gold's still there, hidden where Jake and his men couldn't find it. But I learned something today, Tommy. Gold can't buy loyalty, can't buy courage, can't buy the kind of heart that saves a stranger's life." Hartwell's voice grew thick with emotion. "You gave me all those things freely." Tommy looked around the blood-stained cabin, at the bodies of the men who died for money, at the wounded rancher who was offering him a future beyond his wildest dreams. "What about Pete's family?" the boy asked quietly. "Don't seem right to profit from their misery." Hartwell and Dr. Patterson exchanged glances. Even after everything he'd been through, Tommy's first thought was for others. "Pete's got a sister in Kansas," Hartwell said. "I'll make sure she gets enough money to live comfortably. It won't bring back Sarah or Pete, but it might help." "And Dutch's family?" "Dutch was alone in the world, far as I know," Sheriff Brennan said. "But Jake's got a mother in town who's been struggling. Might be that some kindness shown there could prevent future tragedies." Tommy nodded slowly. "Then yes, sir. I'd be honored to be your son." The words hit Hartwell like a physical blow. In all his 43 years, no one had ever said they'd be honored by his offer. His employees had worked for wages, his business partners for profit, his few friends for mutual benefit, but this orphan boy saw honor in becoming part of his family. 6 months later, anyone visiting the Hartwell Ranch would have seen remarkable changes. The bunkhouse had been expanded and improved, with better food, warmer bedding, and a small library where the hands could spend their evenings. Wages had increased, and Hartwell had established a fund to help with medical expenses and family emergencies. Tommy Sullivan, now legally adopted as Thomas Hartwell, attended school in Denver 3 days a week and worked on the ranch the other 4. He'd grown taller and stronger, but his essential character remained unchanged, kind, thoughtful, and unfailingly honest. The boy kept a photograph on his desk in the ranch house, not of his new life, but of his parents, lest he forget where he came from and what it meant to struggle. Next to it sat a small jar containing coins he'd been saving, not for himself, but for the other orphans still living on the streets of Dustridge. Samuel Hartwell had discovered that the most valuable thing he could pass on wasn't gold or land or cattle, but the lesson Tommy had taught him by Willow Creek, that true wealth was measured not in what you could take, but in what you chose to give. As for the $40,000 in gold that had started it all, Hartwell donated half to build a proper orphanage in Dustridge, naming it the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Home. The other half went into a trust fund for Tommy's education and future, with instructions that any remainder should go to help other children in need. Some evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the Montana prairie, Samuel Hartwell would sit on his porch and watch Tommy playing with the ranch dogs or helping the younger hands with their letters. In those moments, he understood that the boy hadn't just saved his life that day by the creek, he'd saved his soul. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, he swore he could hear the ghost of his wife Margaret, whispering approval across the years. "Well done, Samuel. Well done at last."